Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Monday, August 7th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Most Americans oppose more aid for Ukraine. So this is according to a CNN poll that was released on Friday. And this poll was conducted by SRSR from July 1st to the 31st, so last month. And the sample size was 1,279 people. It found that 55% of the respondents say that Congress should not authorize more spending on the war in Ukraine, while 45% say more funds should be authorized. So another question that they asked is if the U.S. has done enough to support Ukraine. 51% said yes, and 48% said more should be done. And these results show how support for the policy of backing Ukraine against Russia has waned in the United States as the conflict has dragged on. A poll that was conducted when Russia first invaded in February 2022 found that 62% of the people asked thought that the U.S. was not doing enough. So 62% down to 48%. And there's some interesting numbers in here. When asked about what type of support the U.S. should provide Ukraine, only 17% of respondents favored sending in U.S. troops for direct combat operations against Russia, which obviously could quickly spiral into a nuclear war. Good to see that that is so low, although I think 17% still seems a little high because it's just such a reckless idea. But the most popular type of support was assistance with intelligence gathering. 63% supported that. So even though you have people saying that the U.S. shouldn't spend more money on the war, they still think they should be giving Ukraine some kind of support. At least 63% do, with intelligence gathering, which sounds harmless enough, but I think people might not really understand that the U.S. is giving Ukraine, coordinates to bomb, to kill Russian soldiers. So it's an example of how intimately involved in the war planning that the U.S. is. Intelligence gathering is a pretty big part of it. Military training, 53% of them thought the U.S. should provide that. 43% thought they should provide weapons, so the majority do not think the U.S. should be still providing weapons, which is interesting. And breaking it down by partisan lines, more Republicans oppose additional aid for Ukraine than Democrats, as that's been the theme throughout the war. The poll found that 71% of Republicans are against Congress authorizing more spending on the war. And while the majority of Democrats want the U.S. to provide more support for Ukraine, 62% of them were in favor of this new funding. And so far, Congress has authorized $113 billion in spending on this war. And I think that's another part of it, why more people are, against spending more money, is just it's such a huge price tag, over $100 billion in just over a year. And, this poll comes as the White House is expected to soon ask Congress to authorize more funding. And there was that report from Financial Times that I went over last week that said Biden is looking to include military aid for Taiwan in this next Ukraine aid package. So they're going to be looking at funding, a second proxy war as part of this. So it's all... And that's expected. The report said that they're expected to ask Congress for that this month. So it could happen very soon. So, and then you see this poll come out on CNN that shows, most Americans don't want this. At least according to this poll, everybody has their own opinions on how accurate polls like this are. But I think it's good to see this come out, at this time, again, while the White House and Congress are expected to be authorizing more funding. I still think, anything that the White House asked for when it comes to Ukraine is probably going to pass. Unfortunately, that's just the reality. All right, so the next one here, China and India attend talks on the Ukraine war in Saudi Arabia. So the U.S., China, and India were among countries that attended talks on the Ukraine war in Saudi Arabia on Saturday. And these talks were aimed at convincing neutral countries to support Ukrainian demands for a peace deal. So according to the Wall Street Journal, the meeting in Jeddah was attended by officials from 42 countries, including other non-aligned nations such as Brazil, Indonesia, and South Africa. So while being portrayed in Western media as peace talks, Russia was not invited. So these weren't real peace talks. But that was the topic, was, potential ways to end this war. And similar talks were held in Denmark this past June, but there was way more countries attended these ones in Saudi Arabia. Twice as many nations sent delegations to Jeddah. And sources told the Wall Street Journal that at the Denmark summit, which was the previous summit, Ukraine pushed other countries to adopt its demands for peace, which includes a full Russian withdrawal before talks can even happen. But these sources are saying that in these talks in Saudi Arabia, Ukraine did not stress that point. So it's signaling maybe Ukraine is maybe starting to come around to the idea that they can't just keep demanding a full Russian withdrawal, as this counteroffensive is failing and they're throwing an enormous amount of, manpower and equipment into it. So I just put an excerpt from the Wall Street Journal report here because it's interesting. So it reads, quote, "A senior European official said that Ukraine did not push again for its peace plan to be accepted, and other countries were not insisting that Kiev drop it. Nor was there any crossfire over Ukraine's demand for the withdrawal of Russian troops. Ukraine did not press the point, and it was not challenged by developing countries," end quote. So I think that, again, that signals something if Ukraine isn't pressing that, because for so long now that has been the demand. You've had Ukrainian officials say full Russian withdrawal from Crimea as well, not just the territory it's captured. And they also want war crimes tribunals before peace talks can even happen. So completely unrealistic demands. But then at this meeting, they weren't really pushing it. And that would be a big concession. But you have the West, they're still arguing against the idea of a ceasefire. So at these talks, China presented its 12-point peace plan again, which it publicly released in February. And the gist of it is that it calls for a pause in fighting and an immediate resumption of peace talks. But the Wall Street Journal report said that European diplomats pushed back to warn that an unconditional ceasefire could simply create a frozen conflict and allow Russia to consolidate its control of Ukrainian territory. And we've heard that argument before. That's what Secretary of State Antony Blinken was saying back in the beginning of June. Right before this Ukrainian counteroffensive was launched, he came out publicly against the idea of a ceasefire. And knowing what we know now is that, the U.S. and its allies basically knew Ukraine did not have the capability to really push Russian forces back. So just throwing Ukrainians into this meat grinder to keep this war going. So it sounds like there might be some, thought on the Ukrainian side, maybe that maybe they should start talking to Russia. But their Western backers are still warning against the ceasefire. So that's not a good sign. So representing the United States at the Saudi Arabia summit was National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and Victoria Nuland, the ultra Russia hawk who was recently promoted to acting Deputy Secretary of State. And they met with China's envoy that they appointed to seek a peaceful resolution to the Ukraine war, Li Hu, who he recently traveled to Ukraine and Russia. So the Wall Street Journal report said that at the conclusion of the Jeddah summit, there was an agreement that respect for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity should be at the heart of future peace talks between Ukraine and Russia, which is kind of just a general agree. I mean, it's not like a real concrete agreement. And most countries that attended, including China, agreed to hold another summit in the coming weeks under the same format that would also exclude Russia. So still, there's not going to be genuine peace talks until Russia is involved. But again, there's some interesting tidbits in there. All right, the next one here, Ukrainian drone targets a Russian tanker. So Russia has vowed that it will respond to a Ukrainian attack that hit a Russian oil tanker in the Black Sea near Crimea on Friday night, and this came after Ukraine's first strike on a Russian commercial port. So Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said on Saturday, quote, "Such barbaric actions cannot be justified, and they will not remain without response, while their authors and perpetrators will inevitably be held accountable. Facing no condemnation from the Western countries and international organizations, the Kiev regime is busy applying more and more new terroristic techniques, this time in the waters of the Black Sea, end quote. So the following day, this was Saturday night into Sunday, Ukraine reported a massive Russian missile and drone attack that could have been retaliation for this. The Russian Defense Ministry said that they were targeting air bases in western Ukraine. So going back to the attack on the Russian tanker, a Ukrainian security service, the SBU source, told CNN that the Russian tanker was struck shortly before midnight on Friday by a sea drone carrying 992 pounds of TNT. According to Russian authorities, the tanker, the SIG, took on water after the strike blasted a hole in the engine room, and the tanker was assisted by tugboats. So the Russian side said that the ship was not carrying oil at the time that it was hit and that there was no casualties. Ukrainian officials are claiming that some of the crew, which would be a civilian crew, this is a commercial ship, an oil tanker, they said some of the crew were injured and that the ship was carrying oil for the Russian military. So that's a slippery slope. You know, if a ship is carrying oil for the Russian military and they make it a target, you know, there's a lot of weapon shipments in, Poland, and NATO weapon shipments, things are being shipped across the Atlantic from the United States. You know, that opens up a whole can of worms. So this attack came after Ukraine targeted a Russian commercial port for the first time with sea and air drones, and that was early Friday. So over the past few weeks, Russia had been launching major missile and drone strikes on Ukrainian ports after withdrawing from the Black Sea grain deal or saying that they wouldn't renew it. So then we see Ukraine attack a Russian commercial port, which closed the port for a few hours, and they said that they also hit a Russian Navy vessel. So what's interesting is the head of the SBU said on Saturday that Ukraine was responsible for the recent attacks on Russian ships. So this kind of ambiguity that, you know, we've seen a lot of examples of this now with that Ukraine taking credit for the drone attacks in Moscow, the ambiguity about these attacks on Russian territories is gone pretty much. They're admitting to them. And the Ukrainian attacks on Russian ports and ships could escalate as Ukraine's maritime authority issued a warning that 6 Russian Black Sea ports in the area around them are in a war risk area. So things are really escalating, in the Black Sea. And Russia, they were striking the ports on the Danube River, which are right across from Romania, which is a NATO ally. And again, in the Black Sea, where, these drone attacks are happening, there's U.S. and NATO surveillance ships flying around. I mean, it's just such a dangerous area for, it's a potential flashpoint for a real conflict between NATO and Russia. All right, the next one here, Russia says that Ukraine used British missiles to strike a bridge in Crimea. So the acting governor of the Russian-controlled areas of Ukraine's southern Kherson Oblast said Sunday that Ukrainian forces used British-provided Storm Shadow missiles to strike a bridge that connects Kherson to Crimea. So Vladimir Saldo said the Ukrainian attack struck the Chonghar Bridge in the village of Chonghar in southern Kherson. He said, quote, Kiev's terrorists shelled the Chonghar Bridge and the settlement of Chonghar with NATO's Storm Shadows, end quote. He also said that a school was damaged in the missile strikes, but there were no casualties reported. So if you're watching here, I just put up, the screenshot of the Google Maps of the area. So this is kind of a small, narrow channel that this bridge goes over, to give you an idea of what the area is like. So these Storm Shadow missiles, the British started providing them to Ukraine back in May, which marked a pretty significant escalation of NATO support because they have a range of 155 miles, which is pretty significant. And they can be fired by Ukraine's MiG fighter jets. And, this is close to hitting Crimea. I mean, it basically is hitting Crimea with NATO weapons. And this is just the Russian officials' claim, but I don't see why... I don't see anybody disputing the fact that the Storm Shadows were used in this attack. All right, so the next one here, Hiroshima mayor calls nuclear deterrence a folly. So Hiroshima Mayor Kazumi Matsui on Sunday called for world leaders to recognize the folly of nuclear deterrence at a ceremony marking the 78th anniversary of the U.S. dropping an atomic bomb on the city, killing an estimated 140,000 people. And the vast majority of them were civilians, many women and children. So Matsui said, quote, "Leaders around the world must confront the reality that nuclear threats now being voiced by certain policymakers reveal the folly of the theory of nuclear deterrence. They must immediately take concrete steps to lead us from the dangerous present toward our ideal world," end quote. So he urged Japan to join the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which bans nuclear weapons, and it currently has 92 signatories. Tokyo has faced criticism from anti-nuclear weapons activists for paying lip service to the idea of establishing a nuclear-free world while being under the protection of the U.S. nuclear umbrella and rapidly building up its military. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, who represents Hiroshima in Japan's parliament, he also spoke at the ceremony. He said, quote, 78 years ago today, a single atomic bomb deprived people said to number well more than 100,000 of their precious lives. It reduced the city to ashes and deprived people of their dreams and bright futures in an instant. Even those who escaped death suffered hardships that words cannot describe, end quote. So discussing the current global tensions, Kishida singled out Russia for its nuclear threat, as he called it, but he made no mention of the United States in his speech. And by that, I mean he didn't say that it was a U.S. nuclear bomb that was dropped on the city. And nowhere in these Japanese official statements was the U.S. mentioned, which is kind of interesting. And, the U.S. has been engaged in a lot of nuclear provocations lately. Most significantly, it was very close to Japan. The U.S. just docked a nuclear-armed submarine in South Korea for the first time since 1981. This kind of highlights that recent G7 summit that was held in Hiroshima back in May. And when they were all there, the G7 leaders they gathered at the memorial in the city for the victims of the U.S. bombing. And after the visit, the G7 released a statement claiming that they're working toward a world without nuclear weapons, which is a joke. Because considering what the U.S. has been doing, nuclear arms control treaties are crumbling. There's only one left between the U.S. and Russia. And then the policies that were announced during the summit, have brought the world closer to the brink, including President Biden giving the green light to sending U.S.-made F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. That happened at that summit. And, earlier in the war, NATO ruled out giving Russia fighter jets because they said Russia might perceive it as the alliance directly entering the war. So that's, again, they kind of pay this lip service to this idea of a nuclear-free world when, doing everything to stoke global tensions. All right, so I just want to take a moment to mention our sponsor for today's show, which is the Expat Money Summit, hosted by Mikkel Thorup. So this is a really interesting event, and it's for people who have ever, if you've ever thought about moving out of the country or establishing kind of a backup plan, maybe a secondary residence in another country, and you don't know how to go about doing it, how to, apply for a residency, what their equivalent of a green card might be. And that's something that Mikkel focuses on in his work. And if you go to expatmoneysummit.com, you will see that they're having a big online conference from October 2nd to the 6th, to go over, to educate people on those types of things. And the good news is it's completely free. You just have to go to expatmoneysummit.com to get your ticket. You put your email in. That's all you got to do. And you could go there through the link that's in the YouTube description or the podcast description to get there. And some of the things that they'll go over, again, residencies and citizenships, which is the big thing when we're talking about moving outside of the country, wealth protection and tax planning, investing and diversification, the expat lifestyle, community and network, and much, much more. Lots of great speakers. So be sure to go check that out. expatmoneysummit.com. Again, Mikkel is a great guy. He listens to the show. I was recently on his podcast, the Expat Money Podcast. Go check that out. We had an interesting conversation. Again, that's expatmoneysummit.com. All right, back to the news here, and we have another thing about the nuking of Japan. Oppenheimer ignites controversy in Japan. This is just an article from Axios. I thought it was interesting about kind of the public reception of Oppenheimer. So Oppenheimer has generated backlash in Japan for what critics argue is its failure to fully grapple with the destructive reality of the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and its celebration of the father of the atomic bomb. While the film does chronicle J. Robert Oppenheimer's guilt over the deployment of the weapon he helped create, it doesn't truly show what happened under the mushroom cloud. Keiko Tsuyama, a former staff writer for Kyoto News who covered the aftermath of the bombing in Nagasaki, tells Axios. It has been deeply uncomfortable for some Japanese people and Japanese Americans to see the development of weapons that killed upwards of 200,000 people in 1945 become a pop culture phenomenon. And there was also controversy of these Barbenheimer memes because the Barbie movie came out at the same time, and people in Japan were upset about that because there was Barbenheimer that showed Barbie and her hair was like a mushroom cloud. So people weren't, on social media were, not happy about that. So I just thought that was interesting, kind of what Japanese are thinking about this movie. Again, that I still haven't seen. I keep talking about it, but I really do have to go see it. If you saw it, let me know what you think. All right, so the next one here, Nigeria's Senate warns against intervention in Niger. So Nigeria's Senate has warned against military intervention in neighboring Niger after Nigerian President Bola Tinubu requested backing for such an action against Niger's new military junta. So Nigeria currently holds the rotating presidency of the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, which has threatened to use military force if Niger's President Mohamed Bazoum is not reinstated by Sunday. So while the deadline has passed, there's no sign right now as of Sunday night on the East Coast in the U.S. and Monday morning in Africa. I haven't seen any sign yet that there's been any kind of intervention. I know Niger says it was closing its airspace to prepare for the potential attack. But right now, there's no sign that troops are moving or anything. So ECOWAS officials met Friday and said that they finalized intervention plans, but did not indicate when they plan on launching the attack. The president of Nigeria's Senate said Saturday that he urged President Tinubu for ECOWAS to consider all diplomatic and political options before resorting to military intervention. Senators from northern Nigeria particularly stressed exhausting all diplomatic avenues, since the regions that they represent, border Niger, so they could be really impacted by any kind of war there. So a spokesman for the group of northern senators said, quote, "We also take exception to the use of military force until other avenues as mentioned above are exhausted, as the consequences will be casualties among the innocent citizens who go about their daily business," end quote. So, you notice that they're saying no military force until other options are exhausted. So they're still kind of saying, that they would support it if there's no other way to get Bazoum reinstated. And in Niger, the coup government is standing firm against the pressure from ECOWAS, which has included harsh sanctions. The coup leaders have shown no sign of planning to relinquish power. So still not looking good. There's still this threat of intervention, but so far we haven't seen it yet. And at least, Nigeria isn't just running into this thing. As I've covered quite a bit, the U.S. has a pretty significant military presence in Niger. It has about 1,100 troops, which is more than Syria. That's more than Somalia. It's pretty significant, and there's a big drone base. And France also has 1,500 troops, and they're backing pretty strongly these threats to intervene, these ECOWAS threats. So, this could still really blow up into something pretty bad. All right, so the last one here in the news section, Israel's Ben Gvir defends settlers killing Palestinian as heroes. So Israel's National Security Minister, Itamar Ben Gvir, praised settlers suspected of killing a 19-year-old Palestinian in the occupied West Bank as heroes. So this settler attack that killed a Palestinian. The United States has called it terrorism, which is, kind of significant to hear the U.S. say that. But Ben Gvir, who's this real extremist, settler who's in this coalition government with Netanyahu, is celebrating it. And he has a history of celebrating attacks against Palestinian civilians. It's something he's kind of always done. So the minister said on Sunday that anyone defending themselves against stone throwing should receive accommodation. His statement was referring to 2 Israeli settlers accused of being involved in the fatal shooting of Qusay Jamal Matan in the Palestinian village of Barqa on Friday. One of these suspects is a former spokesman of an MP with Ben Gvir's political party, which is the Jewish Power Party. The pair were arrested by Israeli forces on Saturday and held for further investigations. Hours after the initial statement, Ben Gvir took to X, formerly known as Twitter, to criticize media outlets for referring to the settlers as suspected murderers. He said, quote, "A Jew who defends himself and others from murder by Palestinians is not a murder suspect, but a hero who will get full backing from me," end quote. So residents told Middle East Eye that armed settlers arrived at the village from a nearby settlement outpost and attacked them from 3 directions. They said that they assaulted the residents and torched 2 vehicles. When young people in the village came out to confront the settlers and push them back, throwing stones at them, they were met with live fire. So again, the U.S. is calling this a terrorist attack. Ben Gvir is saying that they should be celebrated. So it just, goes to show the kind of people in this Netanyahu government that we're still giving all this military aid to. That's not a question of, the Biden administration is not considering cutting that or anything. But there is more talk about it in kind of U.S. media, which is interesting. That is it for the news for today. Please go check out our Viewpoints. We have one from Tim Sharrock, 70 years after the Korean armistice. So this is a really good article at his website about the trilateral alliance that the U.S. is trying to build between South Korea and Japan. And he's saying this could keep U.S. troops in Asia forever. And it's another thing to reflect on this anniversary, which was yesterday, of the nuking of Hiroshima, and the one of Nagasaki is coming up, how, U.S. troops are still there all these years later, and they're now preparing for another world war, which, a war with China, which would turn into a world war in the region, using those bases that they established after World War II as kind of the launch pads. All right, the next one here, from Ted Snyder. Everyone chose the military option, discussing the Ukraine war. One from Caitlin Johnstone at her Substack. Australia to build U.S. missiles. U.S. dismisses Australian concerns about Assange, kind of comparing the, what Blinken, how he dismissed Australia's concerns about Assange while they were in Australia, signing these new deals on military cooperation. One from Sheldon Richmond at the, this is reprinted at antiwar.com. Shame on government for censoring us. And our spotlight is from Trita Parsi. Marines on Persian Gulf vessels. Is Biden risking war with Iran? And that's that reckless idea of sending armed troops to be on commercial vessels in the Persian Gulf. That's over at Responsible Statecraft. Go check that out. That's it for me for today. You could always support us at antiwar.com/donate. Like and subscribe to this show on YouTube, Odyssey, Rumble. Comment. I appreciate all the comments, all the feedback. Let me know. If you're watching the video, I'm using a different camera. I think this picture looks nicer. So let me know what you think. But I'll be back tomorrow with some more news for you. Thanks for listening.